They surrounded him with voices, many of them sharp, many of them soft, but all of them trying to pull him in different directions. Words fell like rain around him. Some meant to stir, some meant to unsettle, and some carried the quiet weight of expectation. He could feel them pressing against him like wind against a fragile window. Did he need to answer each one? Could he even understand them all? He did not know. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise exist without claiming it as his own. The world outside his mind was loud, restless, shifting constantly. Yet inside him, something fragile began to tremble, a subtle vibration he had not noticed before. It was not fear, not exactly. It was more like a quiet invitation to listen, to notice, to feel the spaces between the words rather than the words themselves. Have you ever felt that moment when the storm of voices moves past you, and yet you are still aware of its presence? It is a strange, tender thing. He felt it now. He noticed how his chest rose and fell, how his thoughts tried to react before he could stop them, and how the impulse to speak, to defend, to explain was already there, whispering insistently. But he let it pass. He let it pass as one lets a cloud drift across a still sky. He wondered if they even realized how loud they had become. Did they know the weight of each word that landed softly or sharply upon his awareness? Perhaps they thought silence meant weakness. Perhaps they thought that listening too long was the same as yielding. Yet he felt, somewhere deep inside, that silence was not empty. It was not absence. It was a space where something greater could emerge, where something patient and wise could take root. The voices continued, weaving patterns of tension and expectation around him. He felt the tug of irritation, the pull of curiosity, the hint of shame. All of it demanded movement, demanded response, and still he remained quiet. There was no anger in him, there was no bitterness, there was only this quiet tremor that asked him to watch, to feel, to breathe. How strange it was, he thought, that in the midst of so much insistence there could be such a gentle insistence within, asking only for attention. He began to notice his own heartbeat, not as a rhythm of fear or defense, but as a steady measure of presence. Each beat reminded him that he existed separate from the noise, yet not apart from it entirely. How many moments had been lost to hurried reactions, to impulsive words spoken before thought could even settle? He could feel the difference, now, as subtle as the movement of air through an open window. He could feel the space between himself and the voices, a thin, trembling line that was both fragile and unbroken. It was in this fragile awareness that he first sensed something like clarity. Not clarity of action, not clarity of solution, but clarity of being. He did not need to understand everything. And he did not need to answer everything. He only needed to witness it, to sit with it, to allow it to exist without letting it fracture him. Could a man remain whole while the world insisted upon his fragment? Perhaps he could. Perhaps he already was. He felt a warmth in that stillness, as if a small light had flickered quietly within him, shy but persistent. It was not a light that demanded recognition. It did not shout or burn. It only existed, and in its existence, it reminded him of something essential, that he was here, and here was enough. He did not have to move to prove his place. He did not have to speak to assert his presence. To simply be quietly and fully was to carry a power that could not be measured by the noise surrounding him. And so he breathed, slowly, feeling the rhythm of his own life beneath the swell of voices. He noticed the subtle movements in his mind, the gentle rise and fall of thought, the spaces that opened between impulses. He wondered, softly, whether the world outside would ever understand this kind of listening. Perhaps it would not. Perhaps it was never meant to. Yet he felt the beauty of it anyway. He felt the quiet bloom of something steady, something unshakable, something that belonged entirely to him. For a long while he sat there, neither moving nor speaking. He let the storm of words circle him, let it press and pull, let it fade and swell again. And in that enduring stillness, he discovered the first taste of a power that was neither loud nor demanding, but patient, calm, and deeply his own. He realized that even in a world of constant noise, a man could find a center that nothing could disturb, a silent place that held him whole, no matter what came next. It was not victory. It was not triumph. It was only the quiet knowing that he could remain himself, untouched by the clamoring around him, anchored in the subtle strength of simply being present. And as he breathed again, he understood in the gentlest way that this was the beginning of something he had not yet fully named, but would one day recognize as the first step toward his own enduring peace. He could feel the pull to respond, a gentle tug at first, almost imperceptible, and then stronger, more insistent. Every word that fell around him seemed to demand attention, as if each one carried a weight that only he could bear. They misunderstood him, of course. How could they not? He had never spoken in their language of urgency, nor had he ever matched their rhythm of expectation, and yet the desire to answer, to clarify, to protect some fragile piece of himself rose quietly within him, like a tide that crept slowly over a still shore. He noticed how heavy each thought became when he lingered on it. The impulse to defend himself, to explain, to be understood, felt like carrying a small stone in each hand. At first, it seemed manageable. Then the stones multiplied, one for every misreading, every assumption, every glance that hinted at judgment. He felt the weight pressing on his chest, slow and steady, and he realized that the act of speaking would not lighten it. Perhaps it would even make it heavier. Have you ever sensed that speaking is not always a relief? That sometimes the act of opening your mouth allows the noise outside to enter even deeper into your own mind? He felt that now. He felt the subtle erosion that came from giving life to every impulse. Each response could be taken, twisted, returned in kind. And still the quiet inside him whispered for patience. Not the kind that waits with fear, but the kind that waits with presence, with careful awareness of every breath, every heartbeat, every stir of thought. He tried to follow the rhythm of the silence, letting it guide him more than any instinct to answer. He observed how his body responded to the pressure, the tension in his shoulders, the tightening of his chest, the restless flutter in his stomach. And then, slowly, he began to notice the space around the tension, the subtle gaps between each thought, each urge, each expectation. It was in those gaps that he felt something new, a quiet measure of freedom. They would never fully see him, he realized. They would never truly understand why he chose stillness over words. Perhaps they would see it as indifference. Perhaps they would call it weakness. And still, he could not pretend that speaking would give him what he sought. What he sought was something far quieter, far subtler than recognition. He sought a kind of integrity that did not bend to the noise, that did not yield to the constant pull of being misunderstood. The temptation to respond remained, always lingering, always flickering at the edge of awareness. Yet he learned slowly that the first victory of inner discipline was simply noticing the urge without acting on it. He could feel the power in the restraint itself, in the simple act of holding a thought without letting it escape into the world. Was it strength, perhaps? Or perhaps it was only the beginning of something deeper, a patience that required nothing but presence and attention. As he breathed, he began to sense the rhythm of his own mind beneath the swirl of misunderstanding. He noticed the clarity that came when words were held back, when explanations were deferred, when the need to be understood was set aside in favor of quiet observation. How strange it was, he thought, that in the very act of remaining still, he felt more alive, more certain, more anchored than he had when he had tried to answer, to justify, to prove. He began to see the faces around him, less as judges and more as mirrors of their own impatience, their own confusion. Each misreading, each quick assumption, each subtle accusation revealed less about him than about the world trying to grasp him in its own way. Could he meet it with anything but stillness? Could he meet it with anything but a gentle, unspoken patience that neither argued nor yielded? Perhaps not, he thought. Perhaps this was the only way to remain whole. In that quiet he felt a shift, small but undeniable. The restlessness within him softened, not completely, but enough that he could notice the calm beneath it. He realized that silence was not empty. Silence was not avoidance. It was a kind of listening that required courage, a kind of presence that asked nothing in return. It was the space in which he could measure his own life against itself, rather than against the constant pull of others' judgments. And so he remained, neither moving nor speaking, letting each word that came at him drift past like leaves on a slow stream. He felt the steadiness of his own breath, the quiet pulse in his chest, the gentle assertion of a self that did not need to respond to be whole. Perhaps they would never understand. Perhaps the world would continue to misread him. And yet, in that enduring silence, he discovered a subtle, unshakable strength, the quiet power of a mind undisturbed by misunderstanding, the gentle dignity of a heart that chooses peace over reaction, the calm assurance that some truths are held, not spoken, and some victories are quiet. He felt the quiet stirring again, deeper now, like water gathering in a hidden spring. The voices around him continued, insistent, weaving patterns of expectation and misunderstanding, yet he no longer felt the pull to respond with urgency. There was a shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the first tremor of wind before the sun breaks through the clouds. What was this feeling that rose inside him, soft and steady, that did not ask for explanation or defense? It was something unfamiliar, and yet it felt like coming home. He noticed how different it was to watch without moving, to witness without speaking. Each word that fell around him, each glance and gesture meant to provoke or to test, no longer touched him in the same way. They were there, yes, but he was here, and here had a depth he had not known before. He began to sense that there was a kind of authority in stillness, a power that did not need to declare itself. Could it be that strength did not always shout? Could it be that the quiet mind carried a weight far greater than any word? He realized gently that his reactions were not his only measure of being. For so long he had believed that to act was to be present, that to speak was to claim his space. But now he saw the truth. There was a different kind of presence, one that did not bend to the world's insistence, one that did not seek validation or acknowledgement. It existed simply in being. And in that existence, he felt a subtle reclamation of himself, a sense of self-respect that had nothing to prove and everything to hold quietly within. How strange, he thought, that choosing silence could feel so alive. Choosing not to respond, not to justify, not to argue, was not a giving up. It was a quiet choosing, a gentle assertion of boundaries that required no words. He felt the first taste of freedom in that restraint, the lightness that came when he no longer carried the burden of proving himself to those who could not see clearly. Was this what power truly meant? Not control over others, not force, but the patient, unspoken command of oneself? Perhaps it was. He watched himself with soft curiosity, noticing how the urge to speak still surfaced now and then, like small flickers of shadow at the edge of a candlelit room. And yet, each time the urge rose, he did not chase it. He allowed it to be, acknowledged it without judgment, and let it settle back into the quiet. In that gentle restraint, he discovered something tender and profound, that true strength could exist without disturbance, that dignity could be upheld without confrontation, that self-respect could grow quietly, like roots beneath the soil. The world continued its chatter, relentless and unaware, and he began to sense a rhythm that belonged entirely to himself, a rhythm that required no applause, no recognition, no witness. He felt the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat, the slow rise and fall of his breath, the subtle presence of his own mind moving calmly through the noise. He could measure his strength not by the responses he forced from others, but by the steadiness he carried inside. And in that measurement, he found a strange and gentle delight, the realization that he was enough, just as he was, even when the world misunderstood him. He imagined softly a life lived in this quiet way, where responses were chosen with care rather than dictated by impulse, where words were spoken only when they were truly necessary, where presence itself became the proof of his integrity. Could there be a deeper sense of freedom than this? Could there be a firmer foundation than the calm acceptance of one's own truth, held without apology, held without display? He began to feel that such a life was possible, fragile and precious, yet rooted in something enduring. There was a subtle joy in the realization that silence could be more powerful than argument, more revealing than explanation, more enduring than any fleeting victory won through haste or insistence. In choosing not to react, he had begun to discover an inner authority, a gentle mastery over himself that no misunderstanding could diminish. He felt a warmth, soft and steady, spreading through the quiet spaces of his mind, a knowledge that he could move through the world without being diminished by its judgments, without being scattered by its demands. And in that gentle knowing, he felt a new kind of peace, a peace that did not depend on the absence of challenge, but on the presence of calm within. He did not need to prove anything. He did not need to shape their understanding. He only needed to remain quietly and fully in the truth of his own being. That simple, unspoken choice, he realized, was perhaps the most profound decision he had ever made. It was a decision that would ripple slowly, subtly, through the course of his life, carrying with it a quiet power, a deep dignity, and the enduring strength of a mind that had learned to rest in its own quiet. Time passed slowly, almost imperceptibly, and yet he could feel it in the gentle unfolding of his own mind. The voices around him had not disappeared. They moved as before, insistent, shifting, weaving patterns he could not always follow. And yet he no longer felt their weight pressing upon him. He had discovered something soft, steady, and enduring within himself, a quiet center that remained untouched by the insistence of the world. Could it be that this was what he had been seeking all along? Not answers, not victories, not acknowledgement, but simply a calm that belonged entirely to him. He felt the subtle pulse of his own presence, a quiet rhythm that had nothing to prove. Each breath was a reminder that he existed apart from judgment, apart from expectation, apart from the endless questions of others. He noticed how the calm within him had grown, slowly, like a tree whose roots sank deep into the soil, unseen but unshakable. The noise around him continued, yes, but he moved through it differently now, not with resistance, not with effort, but with a gentle steadiness that carried its own quiet authority. He thought of how often the world misunderstands those who choose stillness, how often patience is mistaken for weakness, restraint for submission, silence for absence. And yet, he had discovered the truth, that strength need not be loud, and clarity need not be declared. In the very act of choosing silence, of refusing to react impulsively, he had carved a space where his own spirit could breathe freely, untouched by misunderstanding, untouched by expectation, untouched even by the passing of time itself. There was a gentle power in this realization, a calm that did not demand notice or applause. He noticed the ease with which his mind could rest, the quiet attention he could pay to the present moment, the subtle awareness of his own heart moving steadily within him. It was not a grand awakening, not a sudden illumination, but a slow, tender settling into something timeless. Could it be that this quiet presence, so often overlooked, was in fact the deepest form of freedom? Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was the only freedom that endured. He reflected on the many impulses that had once carried him into haste, into words, into action. How many times had he been scattered by the rush to respond? How many times had he felt the sting of misunderstanding, the fleeting disappointment of being unseen? And yet, in the stillness he now carried, he felt a subtle joy, a gentle delight that did not depend on the recognition of others. He realized that there was a life beyond the need to justify, beyond the need to defend, a life in which the quiet mind and the patient heart held all that was necessary. He began to notice how differently he moved through the world now, not in the outward sense, but inwardly. Thoughts no longer drove him as before, emotions no longer pulled at him with the same force. He could feel the distance between himself and the noise, not as separation, not as retreat, but as a gentle, deliberate observation. Each moment became a quiet choice to remain grounded, a conscious return to the inner steadiness he had cultivated. Could this be what it meant to truly inhabit oneself, to live fully within the space of one's own calm? And in that quiet inhabiting, he sensed a kind of dignity, not the kind measured by achievement or recognition, but the kind that grows slowly, quietly, like roots entwining the earth. He felt the subtle pride of a heart that no longer yielded its power to the disturbance of others, the serene satisfaction of a mind that had learned to hold itself intact, even amid misunderstanding, even amid challenge. There was no boast in this, no need to tell anyone, no desire for confirmation. There was only presence, steady and unshaken. He let the silence around him settle into a gentle companion, a soft rhythm that marked the slow unfolding of days and nights. And he felt, quietly but unmistakably, the strength of restraint, the warmth of self-respect, the gentle assurance that he was enough, whole and steady. The world continued to speak, to demand, to misunderstand. And yet he no longer needed their understanding. He had learned, in the softest way, that the calm he carried within was sufficient, that it could weather any storm, that it was a place he could always return to, untouched, enduring, quietly strong. And so he sat, full, present, neither restless nor seeking, holding himself in the tender steadiness of his own heart. The voices moved past, sometimes near, sometimes distant, but he moved through them with the gentle patience of one who has discovered an inner harbor, a harbor that requires nothing but presence, nothing but quiet, nothing but the unspoken strength of a mind and heart at peace with themselves. And in that peace, he rested, fully, calmly, enduringly, at last entirely at home in his own being.